All right, so welcome to the first lecture regarding the course Neural Networks, provided at our Faculty of Mathematics, Physics and Informatics. And the first lecture is going to be very non-technical, like a motivating intro. And yeah, we are witnessing some technical complications, but I just have to continue, I think. So we will talk about connectionism, which is a term that was introduced a long time ago, like a theory of information processing, also called neural networks. So it's based on artificial neural networks. That's the evident biological inspiration, inspired by a human brain. And it has several goals. So one is to better understand how our mind works. And we know that mind is anchored in the brain somehow. So we want to identify some mechanistic principles how our brain operates. So that belongs to the field of interdisciplinary cognitive science. So like modeling cognitive processes, so like a more research-oriented pathway that can be said as a subsymbolic alternative to symbolic approaches. So I'll mention briefly the difference between symbolic approaches to understanding the mind and subsymbolic approaches. And neural networks are an example of subsymbolic paradigm. And maybe more importantly for many of you, what kind of tasks you can solve using neural networks. Because if you go to business, industry, people will be more interested in what you can do practically with these models. And we'll go through a number of tasks using different training regimes, different models with different architectures. So like pattern recognition, classification, associative memory, time series prediction, data compression, data visualizations, and others. And another component that I added here just yesterday, actually, like data generation. This generative AI, it's a new buzzword that originated with invention of large language models, but is continuing. This is already having unprecedented consequences on human society and how we will coexist with AI and this digital world. So a lot of expectations. It's not only language, speech, but also images, video, as you know. I'm not going into philosophy because that would be a special course for that, but you can all perhaps understand what I have in mind. So if we wanted to trace the history of AI in a nutshell, okay, rather than showing a number of slides, one slide speaks for itself. It all started in the 1950s with symbolic AI based on rules, symbolic knowledge representation about what we can represent in the world of blocks of something, objects, what we can do, some planning, using rules, inferencing, etc. And there were some ups and downs and towards gradual shift towards subsymbolic AI, because now we can say that neural networks dominate the field, actually. So this is a very coarse graph that we can see here. And so this, there are very naive expectations. Those people, if you are reading those papers, in like 1 year, 2 years, we'll have solved the fundamental problems of AI, but this was pretty much wrong. So this hard computing, it still works, it's still used, perhaps today in combination with subsymbolic models, but it still has fundamental limitations, and it was very small scale, etc. So going towards the future, now more recent past, these neural networks in the form of deep learning, it's something that dominates the field, and we'll talk about deep learning in much more detail, not today. It's still focusing on concrete tasks like image or games or language. It's still narrow AI. We are not we're moving towards this more general AI, but we're not there yet. Yeah, this is a bit annoying. Disappearing, but okay, I have to live with that. Interestingly, for some concrete tasks, these machines have reached human performance and even exceeded it. Like on image classification, you can test the model, you can test the people, and you'll see that the model is doing much better. Okay. Also games, there's a number of examples where AI has beaten the human, best experts in the field, not an ordinary human, best experts. But it's still a narrow AI. Say it's lacking common sense. What does that mean, lacking common sense? Common sense, we intuitively understand, we have insight into the domain. When I'm doing something, like acting, like maneuvering something, or I'm having a strategy in solving a task in chess or more complex games, I have insight, or into mathematics, I have some insights, I can reason, but what we see in AI systems, they often, superficially, reason very well, but not always. Yeah? You can trick, I'll mention this later, you can trick the machine. For instance, these hallucinations, they are clear evidence of some fundamental problems in the machine, even though they operate excellently in 99% of time. But the question is how they represent knowledge inside their structures. So to contrast symbolic and subsymbolic approaches, so this was like, that's how it started in AI. So we have, for instance, a task like an image of an apple, and the system is supposed to tell whether it's an apple or not, like classified. So, okay, you can devise a model that will be quite transparent because you can interpret the inside or in components of that system, like by language, and you can also trace how it arrived at the conclusion, okay? At the same time, with the neural network, which is much less transparent because it's based on numbers, nothing but numbers, rather than symbols, the machine can still, the neural network can still provide a good answer, a right answer. But these two approaches are fundamentally different, okay? Fundamentally different because even though you could say, well, but they both can be implemented on the same digital computer, right? The neural network will work, can be implemented there, the symbolic system as well. But that's not what matters. What matters is the abstraction from that implementation level, calling it algorithmic or representation level. So it means that these systems differ in types of algorithms and representations, how they approach the data. So for instance, you have rules here, you don't have any rules here. You have matrix multiplication, like vector times matrices, you have it here, you don't have it here. Because here you have different operators, like you have explicit representation, predicates or something, and you have inference rules, how you can derive certain knowledge, okay? So you can imagine all kinds of maybe logical operators or something that gives rise to an answer. Here it's, you start with an image and you just do a series of cascade of numeric operations resulting in an answer. So that's how we can contrast the two approaches. Here I will maybe add that it's not only algebra, like matrix multiplication, but also combined with nonlinearities. We'll talk about nonlinearities, what it means. You all know what nonlinearities are. I'm talking about nonlinearities related to basic activation units, being the neurons. Okay? That you need to warp the information in a nonlinear way. That's crucial for deep networks. So, what can we do with AI? I mean, it seems obvious, like solving tasks in vision, to have a robust vision system that's far from trivial. Our vision works very well compared to artificial computer vision, right? So that's still a challenge for today's machines. It's still a challenge for robots, for instance. It's extremely important to have a very good intelligent vision. Compared to this, speech recognition seems a domain, okay, we excel at, right, obviously, evolutionarily speaking, but it's something that's being mastered by machines already. You know how speech recognition works, speech translation, yeah, or maybe it's a language translation already, but this is being solved already. So that's not a challenge anymore, especially for dominant languages. Compared to this language, natural language, it's still more of a challenge compared to this, because this operates on a high level. You are working here with words, combining words, right? Speech is below it. So here we operate on the text. And okay, these LLMs are doing a great job, like this language technology, but still it still doesn't have the properties of human language understanding. Okay, that would be a special lecture about LLMs, what it entails. There's no time for that. I'm just saying that, okay, it looks superficially very good. These new models are getting improved and, hallucination rate is decreasing, but still there are some fundamental problems from the cognitive science perspective. Intelligent motion is another challenge for AI. How to have robots that move intelligently. Not pre-programmed sequences of certain patterns, but improvised motion, motion that is like a response to environmental changes or something. That's very difficult. One reason is that this is a continuous space, and the complexity of continuous space is much larger than the complexity of a discrete space, which is this, okay, because words are symbols. There is nothing symbolic there. Decision making, for instance, is also an interesting challenge because we constantly have to make decisions. Every day you make hundreds of decisions. How do we do it? It's for us, you can feel that sometimes very easy. Yeah. Sometimes you cannot make up your mind, as if doing two alternatives are competing with one another. That's something that can be nasty more than in a neural network, that you have two competing alternatives, right? So that's something that's very important. For instance, in game playing, this AlphaGo has beaten the best champion in Go game. And okay, so this is not Go game, but that's another game. But you still have to make decisions what to do in order to maximize the reward. And there is a lot of other tasks, like for instance, very popular domain is user models, creating user models. So for instance, recommender systems, that's a very important, I would say, application, of course, that's motivated by profit, like putting us in bubbles, but something like AI creates your own model and knowing how to interact with you, and you do it deliberately, like providing inputs, and being trapped here and there, right? So that's something that can be, okay, it has positive aspects, it also has negative aspects, as always, as all technologies. Okay, now going into neural networks in more detail, but still non-technical. Something about the brain. Brain can be seen as an entity, as a highly nonlinear complex machine, right? From the formal perspective, nonlinear, parallel, complex, composed of a lot of neurons, and it's associated with the computer metaphor of the mind. So, 1950s, the first paradigm of a brain was, it's like a computer. It's like a digital computer. That was the first approximation, but only the first approximation. Composed of this number of neurons. So imagine you have 100 billion neurons in your brain connected with certain ways, not all-to-all connectivity. So it's a sparse graph. The connectivity is at the rate of 10 to the fourth in the cortex. So each neuron is connected to 10,000 neurons in the brain. Okay? Imagine yourself having 10,000 friends who are interacting with you, who are affecting you, sending some signals to you, and you respond based on those inputs from other neurons. And these connections are called synapses. So these are not actually connections, but these are pathways in which the neurons can communicate with one another. An interesting fact, if we are thinking that, okay, we have to deal with this complexity because today's computers are growing fast. If you want to, try to understand the brain, okay, this information makes things much more complicated because the glial cells, which were thought originally to just serve as like maintenance cells, subserving, the function of neurons, no longer have this role because it's been discovered that they are involved also in information processing. And the number of those glial cells is much larger, it's even larger than that of neurons. So imagine how complex our brain is if we are dealing with all those. So we are not in a position to try to model it to a sufficient detail with today's hardware, even though it's growing, regarding the operations per second, but still it's actually, without exaggerating, that's the most complex known entity, compact entity in the known universe, without any doubt. So regarding what do I have there? We can say that on certain tasks, our brain is much faster than supercomputers of today, even though neurons are very slow. That's true. 100 spikes per second is maybe the maximum firing speed, compared to gigahertz clocking speed. So it's 6 order of magnitude difference. But still, because the brains are paralyzed, highly paralyzed, they can, and also the way how they represent knowledge, that's something that has evolved. We're trying to mimic it AI, but I can say in a nutshell that today's AI machines are using more of a brute force computation, using known mechanisms, but they apparently don't match those in a brain. Therefore, therefore the brains are much faster for like a sensory-motor interaction for humans are much faster than any AI system. And the important thing is that the brains are not pre-wired. They are pre-wired, but they are not sort of static, but plastic. So we are constantly updating our structure throughout our life. And that's what we call learning. And the learning is the fundamental mechanism or set of mechanisms that we have to understand during the semester, how the neurons can learn, how we can update the connections between neurons in order to change knowledge in a network. So there are several mechanisms. So either modify the existing synapses, their efficiency, up and down. That's one thing, but that's not the only thing. For it's known that, for instance, new synapses can grow in the brain. So, for instance, if the two neurons need to communicate more intensively, one synapse is not enough because it saturates, it has some limitations. So another one has to grow. Okay. But also new cells can grow. So, for instance, in hippocampus, the new cells are born. So that's another something that we take advantage of. And now, when you look at the brain, so I mentioned those neurons. So you might think, okay, the neuron is a fundamental component of the brain, like a huge graph, sparse graph. That's the formal view at the brain. But we know from neuroscience that we can look at the brain at different scales, a different scale. We can zoom in, we can zoom out, right? We can look at individual molecules, look at synapses or the neurons. Here we have the scale. So, one neuron is not visible by naked eye, right? You need a microscope. Or you can look at assemblies or the whole system, okay? So that's a hierarchical organization. Of course, neuroscientists study maybe the cellular mechanisms or synaptic mechanisms. The others study the whole system, right, as a whole. So ignore the details. So it's inevitable. And the legitimate question is, okay, what's the basic computational level in the brain? Like I said, the neuron, seems obvious that it should be the neuron. But the problem with it is that we are losing neurons on an everyday basis, and we don't notice it. Our minds are stable. So how can that be a fundamental computing unit? Because the computation graph will change every day. So maybe we would need to zoom out and look at maybe these neural assemblies as the fundamental units. Because it's known that you have a lot of neurons sitting next to each other. They are doing the same thing. So there's a redundancy, like backup mechanisms or something. So maybe we can look higher. But there are also some work saying that maybe, well, this is too abstract. Maybe we should go detailed because there's a lot of complicated mechanisms operating on the single neuron within its own subworld, so to say. So, yeah, we don't know. There's no answer because in contrast to the computer, where it's obvious, these are logical gates, 0s and 1s, because that's how the computers have been designed. The brains have not been designed. The brains have evolved. So therefore, we can just try to understand it computationally. So maybe the neurons, artificial neurons, are meant to be representing sets of biological neurons. All right. So, yeah, if you look at the neuron, it's a cell. It's a cell, so it has a body. It has some, this is called dendritic tree, so that when it takes input, has one output, like it's called axon, and that information is branching out. So this information is then received by 10,000 other neurons. The same information, the same number, is sent to 10,000 other neurons. And that neuron collects information from 10,000 neurons. So for your information, in 1 cubic millimeter, that many neurons, 3 kilometers of axons. So how much it is packed, in 1 cubic millimeter. So the neurons were not known to exist, right, in ancient times, but 100 years ago, with a special sophisticated visualization technique, they could color the neurons and see under the microscope that, there's something. So now the idea was much concrete, that, right, there are some discrete units, and they communicate with one another. Yeah, so I said synapse, it's not technically a connection, because, for instance, this axonal branch, this axonal ending, it's not connecting to the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. It's just very close to it. Okay, so very close to it, like a fraction of hair thickness. So here we have another picture showing that, okay, that signal, the signal transfer. So if this neuron acts, if this neuron fires or sends out an information, that information is propagated without any, without any loss here, and then this propagates to one of these postsynaptic neurons. So there are some chemical mechanisms taking place which we don't need to understand. It would be much too detailed, but basically we can just say that the information, that electrical signal that propagates to the presynaptic neuron is then converted to the chemical signal through the diffusion, and then it's converted back to the electrical signal. Okay, so that's how the information gets propagated. And so this conversion is as it was described already. And we have two types of neurons, which is very important to mention, that excitatory versus inhibitory connections, because excitatory connection means that the presynaptic neuron excites the postsynaptic neuron, meaning that it contributes to the postsynaptic neuron firing, right? As opposed to the inhibitory connection, so this presynaptic neuron, if it activates the postsynaptic one, it decreases its probability of firing. So as if your friends were telling you, yes, do it, the other was telling, no, don't do it, and you have to decide. So you are under the pressure of two opposing forces. In the brain, it's roughly 85 to 15%. It's obvious that we need inhibition because otherwise, the activation propagation would not be controlled, like in epileptic seizures. So we need like a negative inhibitory control in the brain that's being like maintained dynamically in a self-organized way in the brain. Good. Now, I mentioned the synaptic connection. Now, the neuron, what kind of a unit it is? Well, if a neuron is made to fire, the generated action potential traverses along the axon uninhibited. So it means made to fire. So the neuron is not making any decisions. It's a low-level computing element. And it is under the pressure or influence of those 10,000 connected neurons. And from the biophysical perspective, we can say that in the quiet resting state, the neuron is still, there's a kind of a tension because the inside of the body, cellular body, has a negative voltage or negative voltage compared to the environment, which is zero, like minus negative 70 millivolts. Okay, so as if you have a bow and arrow, like constantly, so this imbalance has to be kept by using some mechanisms. And when that threshold has increased to like minus 55 or something, then the neuron is made to fire. Okay? So there is a lot of pumps like sodium, potassium. Yeah, it's all neuroscience details. I don't want to bother you with that. But it is important that the neuron is made to fire if certain threshold is crossed. Membrane potential exceeds that excitation threshold. And the neuron spikes, and if it spikes, it becomes exhausted. It has to recover from that spiking, so it's called refractory period. So it needs some time to recover, but it's very short. So you can boost the neuron to fire like 100 spikes per second. That's quite fast, and the neuron can cope with that. There are individual differences how the neurons fire. There are a lot of theories regarding the neural code, because, for instance, if you know that neuron spikes, they send spikes here and there. If you do the recording and you question, okay, so what's the information encoded in those spikes? Is it every single spike that matters? Definitely not. Is it their mutual alignment or something, spatial temporal pattern? That's something. Is it just the average rate that you can count how many spikes per second? That's the information that's considered important. There is no answer to this question because there's a lot of evidence showing that single spikes don't matter because there's a spontaneous activity. There's a spike here and there and they don't contribute. But there's still an ongoing agenda for the theoretical or computational neuroscience. Yeah, and when the neuron spikes, so it matters how many spikes it receives, but also how they are temporally aligned with one another, because they are coming at distant moments, right? And each of them contributes to increasing the threshold or the potential until it fires. So when we'll be talking about basic models, so the very elementary model is this one, a neuron that it has some inputs, and each input contributes or affects the functioning of this neuron, and with a concrete weight. So what we call synaptic efficiency in the brain, which means that how efficient is one neuron, presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, how efficient it is, so that can be quantified by a number. So if I was talking about excitatory connections, that would correspond to a positive number, positive real number, the weight. Inhibitory connection would correspond to a real negative number. Okay? So that's how we formalize this. So basically what it does, it calculates the weighted sum of these inputs. So that's step 1, 2, 3, right? So it processes, integrates incoming signals. So it's this one. And this internal, that corresponds to this like a internal potential in the neuron. It has to be converted to the output response. And we'll have a variety of neurons that will differ in this procedure, in this activation function, how they transform the internal signal to the output signal. Okay? So this model is deterministic because there is a well-defined input-output relation, right? The output determines, is based on inputs, nothing but inputs, and the threshold. Here the threshold differs from a biological one because biological one is something that's a characteristic of a neuron. It's a constant, but here it's a parameter. Okay, it can also be learned, and we understand why it's good that it can be learned. Compared to these deterministic models, we also have stochastic models. We'll also talk about those, but much less than deterministic ones. Okay, so in a stochastic model, we can calculate the probability of an output being 1. Rather than saying that it's 1 or 0, we can work with probability. So there's some uncertainty is given there, but it's a well-described mathematical model. And for instance, using this equation, we can calculate that based on the inputs, based on this signal, what's the probability that the neuron will be active. So that's a stochastic. There's a huge field of stochastic models that are also very important, but in the course we'll have just, that's actually one and a half lectures dedicated to that. All right. Now I say something about features of artificial neural networks, so that we have some theoretical understanding where we are operating, in which field. So this is, I think, obvious that crucial is the nonlinearity of these neurons, because if you cascade nonlinearities, you can create very complex mathematical transformations, which are important, which underlie all tasks. We will talk about input-output mapping, right? So each neural network is a box that needs inputs and that generates outputs of certain kind, depending on the task. And it's called non-parametric statistical inference because we don't need to make any assumptions regarding the distributions of data, unlike some Bayesian models or probabilistic models. We just don't care. We just take the data, we'll train it on the data, and we will then evaluate, assess the performance of the model. Another core feature is adaptivity. So we'll be tweaking parameters or tuning parameters of the model. We can talk about evidential response, which means that, for instance, in a classification, you will have output neurons that will be representing classes, and the outputs that can be interpreted as probability, posterior probability of belonging to a certain class of an observed input, can be also interpreted as kind of confidence, that the higher the number, the more confident the model is that it's class this one. Okay? It's based on the soft assignment that, the neural network doesn't have to tell you that this is 1, everything else is 0, but it'll provide a distribution over the classes, like soft assignment. Neural network is highly contextual, so, this because of this connectivity. So, for instance, contextual information is extremely important for recurrent neural network models, where the answer of a network does not only depend on the current input, but also the context, which is the state. Okay? We'll have recurrent architectures. That's a separate category of models. The neural networks are often said to be fault tolerant, which means that if we have a trained model and we lesion certain part of the network still works very well, or its performance can be degraded gracefully. It's a kind of robustness in this sense that because of the highly distributed nature of knowledge representation in the network, not everything is everywhere, but the piece of information is distributed. So if you lesion it, if you do the ablation study, you can see that the model still works very well. That's a very good feature of the model, very important. Implementable on hardware, neurobiologically inspired and serving as an analogy to artificial brains. We can approach the design of a neural network in a uniform way, and when we analyze it and when we design it and analyze it. So there are some guidelines how to design an architecture, how to train it, how to test it, etc. There's some uniformity in this respect. And another important thing, that environment is crucial for designing a network. So you always need data. The neural network without data is useless. It has to be trained on certain data. And it's not a designer approach in the sense that, like, if you're an expert and you're designing simple, well, you can come up with some rules based on your knowledge of the domain. But here you don't have to know the regularities in the data, but you can let the neural network decide or reveal those regularities by training. Okay? But you need those data. And of course, we know that the better the data, or if the data is low quality data, the model can only be low quality, because you cannot make miracles if the data is not good enough. What is the negative aspect? So I mentioned that robustness regarding this graceful degradation. On the other hand, we have to talk about lack of robustness against adversarial attacks. So that's a relatively new feature. It's been 10 years already since this vulnerability to adversarial attacks has been revealed. What does that mean? Well, if you have a well-trained model that generalizes very well, you can easily trick it by well-crafted adversarial inputs. So imagine an image, you change 2 or 3 pixels there, knowing how to do it. You have to do it in a sensible, tricky way. And then suddenly, the network tells you that's a completely different class. Something that does not exist in human vision, because our vision is truly robust. We cannot be tricked in such trivial ways. But this is a fundamental problem. Not only for image classifiers, also for LLMs or gameplay machines, everything. You can trick it. And that simply reveals that there are some fundamental problems regarding how the knowledge is represented in these machines. And the question is how to compensate, how to solve this problem. That's not an easy thing, but at least the problem has been identified. I don't think I have to go into more detail of that, but it's something that, just makes us understand that, well, something that looks superficially perfect, at the naked eye, you can trick it. And of course, that prevents these models from using them in safety critical applications, obviously. We'll go through various models of neural networks. So, I used to have this label neural network architectures. Now I added this prefix classical because, for instance, you will not find transformers here because today's models are so large, so huge, much less transparent. That's what we are using. And, more comfortable way of using these complex models because we have a lot of libraries prepared, pre-trained models, etc., etc. So the level has shifted, the approach has shifted, but we still have to go through these basics because it's important to have insights into the field without knowing some basic mechanisms, how much simpler models work. Not all of those, but some of those. It's fundamental. And it's interesting that some of these, quite many features of those are reused in more modern models. more scaled up models. So when I said that, connectionism that appeared, 70 years ago, the very first neural network model came up along with the birth of a computer, invention of a computer, because there was a digital computer already out there. The concept of Turing machine was known as a formalization of some computational processes. And yeah, people were interested. Well, we have a computer, so a brain could be a computer, something like a logical thing. So McCulloch and Pitts, these two guys, came up with the first model as neuron with threshold logic. So a discrete neuron which behaved as a logical function. So it had several inputs, one output, all logical. And the rule was, okay, y is 1 if threshold has been reached. So depending on this threshold, for instance, you can use this to implement or AND function, or even XOR, yeah, whatever, a logical combination, a Boolean function, basically. There were no weights, actually, so all weights were 1. So there was no room for weights, no room for learning. It was like hardwired logical function that could be used for this. And you can actually implement these Boolean functions, which means that mapping the set of logical inputs to one logical output. So we can say, like, two major claims, that if you take one neuron, that one can simulate any linear Boolean function. Linear Boolean function means that if you look at it as a classification problem, so for some inputs you are supposed to get 0, for the other inputs you need to get 1. So it's a binary classification problem. And linear meaning that the two classes can be separated by a hyperplane. So for instance, if you take AND, that's a linear separable function, right? Because AND, like if we draw it in 2D, so we see that if we just have two inputs, x1 and x2, so for AND, the truth table would look like this. So for logical AND, it's true if both are true, both attributes. So the separability could be shown this way, that would be logical AND. But instead for logical OR, it would be this one, true, true. So the separating hyperplane would be somewhere else. But these are all linear. So one unit can do that. But we also have other functions like XOR, for instance, which is not linear separable. Therefore, this unit cannot do that, cannot solve that task, right? But in order to solve this, in order to implement this function, we would need to combine these logical units, and we would have two-layer architecture, two-layer neural network composed of these elementary blocks. And they could simulate any Boolean function of this type, because if you realize that any Boolean function can be transformed to a normal conjunctive or disjunctive form, that it means that the first layer takes care of all those conjunctions and the other one, the upper of disjunction, or vice versa. Okay? Because we can rewrite using these rules. So that was some elementary knowledge about, okay, how we can implement such a thing using these first generation neural network. But that was not a real neural network, because what was missing was this learning thing. So it was like a designer approach, complete designer, right? But this was the time when these neural networks were born and AI was also born. Now, some milestones. We can talk about this classical connectionism, starting with this logical model, but it arose, this connectionism. That's a term that existed. What I learned that existed also in ancient Greece. Connectionism, like concept of connections of something and something. They have two entities. They are connected in a certain way. Also, our mind is excellent at making associations. That are connections, like between two things. And there are different nature of these connections. So that's something that existed, but of course there was no idea how it could be materialized and made more concrete, formalized in human mind. So later, this first wave was already associated with some theory of artificial neural networks, some training algorithms, how to make the neural network learn. And we also talk about this cognitive science revolution back that time. And the second wave that followed afterwards already brought some new discoveries, and that's associated with so-called parallel distributed processing. This is what we associated mostly with error backpropagation learning. That's the algorithm that you'll need to understand in detail. Right, not only call the function optimize and it's solved, but you have to understand truly what's going on in there. So therefore, we have it in the agenda. And that's an example of the sub-symbolic processing because the knowledge is distributed. We'll talk about multi-layer neural networks. We'll include also recurrent neural networks. Back in that wave, probabilistic models appeared. We'll mention them. Then the third wave, it started with, renaissance of neural networks. Yes, starting maybe 2006, this is when Hinton came up with the deep belief network model, like a stochastic model that can do interesting stuff. But it continued, and deep learning was already like 212, for instance, AlexNet, one of the milestones for deep learning. Convolutional neural networks will be mentioned, reservoir computing will be mentioned regarding this history, because still it's being developed. And it's interesting that I think I had fourth stage, but it was not saved there. What I mentioned there, maybe, that was just I just made it up, after 2022, that may be the onset of a new era, like a new period, like these generative models started with ChatGPT. So I think it deserves special attention. So I had it there, but it didn't appear here. All right, so the fundamental question in AI is how is knowledge represented? And that's where like symbolic models differ from sub-symbolic models. How you represent knowledge. What the system knows about the world. You have to have it. So for instance, like a memory, like a long-term memory would be. So something that refers to stored information or models used by a person or machine to interpret, predict, and appropriately respond to the outside world. One of the many definitions, If you have some knowledge about the world, you typically have a model, right? It's not like they have a storage of some observations here and there. You would not have a large enough memory. The fundamental thing is that you extract the model out of infinitely or high number of observations. And you can use that model, you can update that model constantly. And all these neural networks are models, basically. We can have some, our brain, for instance, we have some like what we call episodic memory. We have some snapshots that are truly snapshots of our past experience that we keep in memory, like special moments. But we keep only maybe a very, very, very small fraction of all those experiences we had, right? Otherwise, we would have been overloaded. So, our brain knows what to store, what's worth storing. So in a neural network, the knowledge has to be represented somehow. Right? We have to learn the task and maintain it. In order to do so, we need some examples. These will be labeled or unlabeled. I think you have heard of this. And it's often this knowledge represented goal-oriented, which means that intelligent machine, we have to have a good knowledge representation. Well, in neural networks, you don't have a large maneuvering space how to represent knowledge because it's all in the weights, right? What you can do is to devise an architecture. And architecture itself is a source of knowledge, right? How you enable the information to flow in a modular network, that matters. And everything else is beyond your concrete control because the learning algorithm takes care of proper knowledge representation in terms of these weights. So we can say that this long-term knowledge in the neural network is distributed in the weights. Where else? It's in your brain. You have 10 to the 15th synapses, so that's where your knowledge about the world resides. And it's constantly updated. Every single day it's updated during night it's consolidated, etc. It's a never-ending story. In the machines as well, but like I said, also the architecture itself constrains knowledge because it sort of determines how the information can be propagated inside the network. Yes. It's missing here. Okay, so we'll go through different architectures and we can talk about the subfields of AI. So for instance, in 1950s when it started, so this was a typical feed-forward architecture. So you have some input and the experts handcrafted features, so they came up with some procedures how to extract information from raw data. So if there was an image, they ran certain procedures how to extract sound. It was not done automatically, but by hand, by experts. Yeah, and then maybe they could design. Yeah, in this case, they designed the entire model, the complete model. Maybe the rules were extracted here, or we created here some rules. Later, like classic machine learning, so there was room for learning some parts. So this was hand-designed features, but I mean this mapping from the hand-designed features to outputs was learned by a proper algorithm. Yeah? So that's what is origination of some machine learning parts. And now in more modern way, this what we call representational learning, because the network is led to learn the representations inside its body, right? So all these gray areas, this is something that's learned. These representations, these are vectors of numbers here and there. For instance, the higher you go, the more abstract they are, which is something that also our brains does, that we build, we go from raw data to very high abstract categories by increasing abstractness of those representations inside the network. So here there's even more layers, like simple features, more abstract features, mapping from features. Okay, so this is all learned. This is often called end-to-end learning. End-to-end learning is an approach where you deliberately not want to interfere with the network. You just give it labeled examples, input-output pairs, and you let the network do the entire job. Okay? That's on purpose, end-to-end. That let the network do it. It will know how to do it. It will, devise responsibilities to all those neurons, such that not all neurons do the same thing, but they decide how they split their responsibilities, their preferences, etc. So that's the approach. That's like elegant. We don't have to worry about these steps that we've done before. I have a quote mentioning this computational intelligence. So everybody has heard of artificial intelligence because it's becoming very popular. Nobody knows about computational intelligence, even though it's a field, it's a subfield. So I would say that this is a set of methods, computational intelligence, that are all nature-inspired and they are heavily based on learning. So for instance, logic-based systems cannot be found there. Like a rigid logic, Boolean logic is not there. But Boolean logic is part of traditional AI, right, in symbolic systems. Okay, so it's called, this soft computing is the proper term describing this computational intelligence. So I would say that neural networks are a core component of computational intelligence, but also artificial intelligence, which is a superset. So if you look into the literature, so for instance, this is one view that you have AI system, all types of AI. Part of that is machine learning, and part of machine learning is deep learning, okay, with this nested architecture. But there are alternatives views saying that, okay, there's part of AI that don't belong to machine learning, but still the deep learning is part of machine learning, okay? And there are different arguments why we can say you can be a proponent on one or the other, right? So the different relationship between AI and machine learning. So when it comes to machine learning, we'll go through all these paradigms. So supervised learning, which is maybe most commonly known, that you have labeled instances and you have to establish the mapping between inputs and targets. In order to do so, you let the network or the system learn, and learning from errors, because these differences are used for updating the weights. As opposed to this, it's this unsupervised approach where the system still learns without any feedback from the environment. So it uses unlabeled data, but still there is something to learn from, because the data is typically structured and redundant. So you can have learning rules that can help you extract some regularities for various purposes out of the environment. Okay. And the third in the group is this reinforcement learning, which is standing somewhere in between the two, because this is taking the reward from the environment as a reward, which is fundamentally different from the target signal, because reward does not occur for every input. It can be sparse and it's much less informative. It's a value, it's a scalar value telling you how good or bad you are doing. Okay, and we humans we use all three paradigms in our everyday life. There's a special dedicated course on reinforcement learning at this faculty. So we'll go through examples, but just here in a nutshell, software classification is maybe the most common task performed by neural networks when you need to classify data into predefined classes. You can do regression where the target variable is no longer discrete, but it's continuous. And you can have like 3 different models here, representing, learned from the same data. Mm-hmm. Or we can also go to temporal domain, so not a spatial problem, but a sequential problem that you receive this temporal series, time series, and you're supposed to predict what comes next. Okay, so like a financial forecasting, weather, and whatever. So you can use, for instance, recurrent networks there. Or I would say that autoencoders also belong here. So we'll mention autoencoders. So that's a kind of self-supervised learning because the inputs are also targets at the same time. And it's useful to use this latent low-dimensional representations for various things. Unsupervised, for instance, feature extraction. You have a lot of redundancy in these images, right? That's our brain is also bombarded with millions of photons, and we have to make sense of that scene. So there's obviously some features, some artifacts on the landscape. So the AI system should be able to extract those features in some way, or find some clusters. So if some data could be grouped together, that could be represented by some centroids of those clusters. So that's an unsupervised technique. Or we can be looking at some patterns. For instance, here we have instances of handwritten digits. So if we have that top-down information that these are digits, 10 classes, okay, we understand much better what this is about. But imagine that you didn't understand those. So for you, you would have a harder time to differentiate between the different instantiations, right? If you don't have the top-down knowledge. So doing it completely bottom-up is much more complicated. Or for instance, here you have some spatial forms, and it's a continuum of forms, right? You can look at some prototypes. What could be the most representative example of this domain? Could be a question. Or one more example here, for instance, when we talk about dimensionality reduction, so like in this trivial case, you have 2-dimensional data, and you want to project it to 1 dimension, looking for the most informative dimension. Okay, this is very trivial, but of course we can do it with PCA. We do it with very high dimensionality, and the neural networks can also do PCA. Or last but not least, data visualization. You have high-dimensional data, and you want to project it in 2D space in nonlinear way in order to be able to visualize, to see whether there are some categories or something. Okay, this is very useful, but you have to go down to 2D. Good. And for reinforcement learning, there are, AlphaGo. The champion was beaten back then. So the problem has been solved with reinforcement learning in combination with classical AI, I would say, like tree search. Object manipulation is a very good example of a continuous domain. We need to train the robot to grasp an object of certain spatial configuration and properly grasp it. You have a certain number of degrees of freedom. That's far from trivial, right? So, and you cannot easily, there are various techniques how one can approach it, but the most natural one is like what kids do, that they just take advantage of the vision, proprioception, etc., and they learn this sensory motor mapping in real time. Locomotion, so there the robot doesn't move anywhere. Here it moves, so it moves in space. So learning it or training it a proper policy how to move like in a straightforward way in order to cross a certain distance in limited time. Or game playing, the discrete domain. These were continuous. This is a discrete domain of very high dimensionality. But of course, here is also the room for neural networks because, for instance, even this is discrete, you can still benefit from using the function approximators implemented by neural networks. Because we need to create a model how, for instance, to map this state to the ideal action, optimal action. So, I mean, this deep network can serve that job. Yeah, so, all right. So this is about learning the policy. And we'll have examples of these networks like error correction learning or memory-based learning when the knowledge is stored in examples, or Hebbian learning, which is an example of unsupervised, competitive, which is also unsupervised in some models for learning features, or Boltzmann learning, stochastic models when the model behaves in a probabilistic way and is inspired by statistical mechanics. Right, progress. Well, tracking the progress, we can benefit from the speed up of the hardware. So today we can simulate tasks which were unthinkable a few years ago. We have the luxury, but of course, these models, many models are very greedy. That's another example of suboptimal approach that you need so much data, several orders of magnitude more than humans in order to learn something in the domain. But we can afford it because, I mean, the hardware is powerful enough. When it comes to some research streams, what I mentioned here is that, for instance, reservoir computing is not known widely, I would guess, but it's a quite well progressing research agenda because it's an efficient way of solving spatial temporal problems because of using these reservoirs. It's a very efficient way how to represent knowledge in a reservoir in order to do, for instance, prediction or classification tasks. We will not be talking about, for instance, computational neuroscience because it's a separate field. It's also about neural networks, but these are spiking neural networks. Okay, we'll be dealing with classical activation-based neural networks. The spiking, there's a lot of reasons why it's a good idea to switch to this, and many teams are doing this already. Not only the speed up, but also ecological reasons, because you all know how much megawatts of energy spent by training a single huge model. It's months of training, it is a megawatt. So countries are thinking about constructing new nuclear power plants in order to compensate or to provide enough electricity or power to this. So this definitely has limitations, but this could be the solution: sparse spiking codes. I was talking about knowledge representation, and you can represent the same knowledge in sparse spikes, and you can do the same task with, let's say, only 100 times less energy spent. Yeah, so that's a lot of motivation for this quest for neural code, how to do it. I think it's also called this neuromorphic computing. So taking inspiration from humans, human nature, and how we could represent knowledge. Because, yeah, what only matters is that we want to solve the task. Really, it's not important how we solve it, what kind of vehicles we use, but we want to have it solved reliably. Yeah, that's what matters. And this is definitely a promising alternative for the future. Yeah, there are trends towards explainable and trustworthy AI. Maybe some of you, has anyone registered for this new course that we're providing at the department? Right. So we were thinking that would be useful because it came up with this, sub-symbolic huge models which are much less transparent. Nobody understands how they work. And of course, we want to make those models explainable, that are using methods that explain how the model arrived at an answer, why the model thinks there's a tumor. So the model should provide some explanation. And if something is explainable, it can be thought to be trustworthy, that you can trust the model, right? I mentioned this adversarial vulnerability. Well, goes against trustworthiness, unfortunately. So that's a serious problem. Also, ethical AI acts, all that. I mean, we all need safe, trustworthy AI solutions. Yeah, these generative AI, generative artificial neural networks, large language models. So there's a lot of progress. That's unbelievable how fast it's progressing. It's really hard to even follow the abstracts of interesting papers. So it's not only large language models, now it's multimodal large language models. So it means that we need to couple the language models with other modalities to make them, to connect them to the world, because the LLM itself is a closed system hanging in the air. It's not grounded in the world. So therefore it lacks understanding, lacks common sense. But, you know, in robotics, for instance, it's important that we're trying to at least couple, it started with like a vision language models, that you couple images with descriptions. So at least you're trying to put two pieces of information together, different I would say different representational schemes, because this is a pixel map, this is a set of words, set of or sequence of symbols, and there's a very complex mapping between the two, right? Now they're adding it to some acting information, like if you have a robot, so the robot acts in the world, so like using proprioceptive information, what needs to be done in order to, let's say, grasp an object that's shown in the scene, what the robot has to do in order to solve the task. So there's a very preliminary attempts to go towards some grounded understanding, but still much different from how humans have learned all those tasks during development, right? That's a fundamentally different thing, and there's a lot of discussion about that, whether, for instance, this alternative pathway will eventually be successful enough. We don't know yet. It's progressing fast. We'll see. In 5 years, okay, there is a class in 5 years from now. It will be maybe much more information here provided at the end. Maybe with this neurosymbolic approaches, like revitalized. This was here like from 1990s, it is combining symbolic and sub-symbolic components. Now maybe, this is largely sub-symbolic, maybe combining this with some ontologies, now some knowledge graphs, in order to have some, dually formed, dual representations, and connecting these two to make it more explainable, maybe more reliable, etc. So we could benefit from that. And there's a lot of effort, like going from narrow AI, which is still the dominant approach, to general AI, artificial general intelligence, to having a new term is also agentic AI, that you have a system which is autonomous, able to do all kinds of tasks, like humans, sensory motor, language, memory, whatever, planning, spatial orientation, etc., all in one architecture. That's very difficult. So the generative AI, that's a new agenda, which will have and already has a lot of consequences. So this is a very nice paper that I found from last year, like going beyond this classical AI, going towards artificial general intelligence, and going towards acquiring common sense. There's a lot of agenda in that. There's a very packed paper, but okay, it lists these milestones, have it started. So we'll be tracing everything from the beginning, starting with perceptrons, going through several milestones here, but all that is oriented around these large language models, huge generative AI solutions. Okay, so regarding the course, we'll go through several topics. I try to put them here. So we'll start next week with one neuron, and we'll spend some time discussing one neuron of different types, what we can expect from a neuron, and then we will go to a single layer artificial networks, supervised, then proceeding to multi-layer perceptrons, but also taking a path towards unsupervised single-layer models, and then simple recurrent networks, fully recurrent networks, gated recurrent networks, all these like advanced optimization techniques, how we can optimize the model, deep convolutional networks, self-supervised deep networks, and these two could not be easily connected to the rest, but they belong because this, for instance, is two examples of an architecture where you do dimensionality expansion rather than reduction. So you project the data to high-dimensional space for some reason. And you'll see why it makes sense. And last but not least, these recurrent models will be also completed with these stochastic architectures. Okay? So this is in a nutshell. I try to optimize it, not to ignore like old stuff, because some students will think, okay, it should be much more modern. Okay, this is an introduction to AI, artificial neural networks, so I don't want to, underestimate the importance of key elements, key concepts, and we will build on them towards the most advanced architectures. Okay, so I hope that I will manage this. During this pathway, we'll have 1 semester for that, and all those, exercises, you'll be practically playing with some equations. That will be some pre-solved codes, and you will be filling in some missing elements to make sure that you understand how to properly multiply the vector by the matrix, and to make sense out of that, what's going on inside the matrix. Okay? So, that's it. I think that was my last slide. I think so. So, thank you.